Maybe you heard about the time that St. Peter challenged God to a golfing match. God teed off and with a mighty swing sliced the ball way off into the rough. Well, just as the ball was about to hit the ground, a rabbit darted out of the bush and caught the ball in flight. And as he ran with it down the fairway, suddenly a large eagle with pinpoint accuracy swooped down and picked up the rabbit. And as the eagle started to fly away with the rabbit, a young man who happened to be close drew back a slingshot he happened to have with him and hurled a rock at the eagle. And while the rock didn't hurt the eagle, it jolted her enough that she let go of the rabbit. Well, the rabbit just so happened to land on the green, and when the rabbit landed, the ball popped out of its mouth and rolled right into the hole. St. Peter turned to God, greatly annoyed, and said, "Come on now. Do you want to play golf, or do you just want to fool around?" Not a few people think that in light of the immensity and the pervasiveness of injustice and equality and suffering in the world, God is just fooling around with us. In the Hebrew Bible, the Psalms known as the Psalms of Lament, and there are more Psalms of Lament than there are any other Psalms. But the Psalms of Lament express cries of God, cries of help to God in times of deep distress and anguish. And the Psalms of Lament often sizzle with questions of why? Why, God? Why me? And one of the most well-known Psalms of Lament is Psalm 22, which Jesus quotes or echoes during his own great time of suffering, during the time of his execution. When he is crucified on the cross, he cries out, according to the Gospel of Mark, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That line is lifted right out of Psalm 22. And the psalmist who says that, my God, why have you forsaken me?" goes on to say, "Well, why are you so far from helping me? I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, and I find no rest." One could interpret the song by the artist Pink, "What About Us?" as a kind of modern day psalm of lament. She sings, "We are searchlights, we can see in the dark. We are rockets pointed up at the stars. We are billions of beautiful hearts. And you sold us down the river too far. What about us? What about all the times you said you had the answers? What about all the broken happily ever afters? What about all the plans that ended in disaster? What about love? What about trust? What about us? We are problems that want to be solved. We are children that need to be loved. We were willing, we came when you called, but man, you fooled us. Enough is enough." Sometimes we weep, not because of what we have done to others or what others have done to us, but because life is what it is, which causes us to question God or even blame God. So sometimes it may just well be that rather than forgiving someone else or even forgiving ourselves, it may be God that we need to forgive. bad things, tragic things happen simply due to the randomness and the unpredictability of life. And some people hold it against God, that God would allow so much injustice, that God would permit so much evil and suffering in the world. Now, I think every person has to struggle with this in his or her own way. And I have struggled with it over the years. And I have resolved it for myself. Now, the way that I have resolved it may not work for you. And that's okay. My belief is that God only had one option, namely what science calls evolution. I believe that the evolutionary development of life, with all the suffering that evolution brings, was the only option to God for creating life. I mean, I believe in science, and so I believe in evolution. 99% of scientists believe in evolution. And I believe that that was God's only option for creating this universe and for creating life within this universe. So I personally don't feel any need to forgive God. I believe God creates from within the universe, not from without. So I believe God is doing all that God can do. And I also believe God is such an intimate part of the creation itself that God suffers with the creation. I don't think God is immune to suffering or that God is distant from our suffering, that God is right here in the midst of our suffering because God is a part of everything. God is a part of our lives. I don't believe that the incarnation, what we as Christians call the incarnation, the God becoming embodied in flesh, I don't believe it began with Jesus. I believe it began with the Big Bang, or whatever process brought this universe into existence. God's presence, God's Spirit, God is a part of everything. I look at the cross of Jesus, his execution, his suffering unto death at the hands of the powers that be. And I see the cross of Jesus, his cruel suffering and death, as symbolic of the continual self-giving and suffering of God for the well-being and the good of the world. I see God pouring God's self out every day in this world, participating in our suffering. Now, I realize that many religious people do not share my view of God's relationship to the world. They see God more as an other, out there somewhere, distinct from creation. I see God as intimately connected to everything that is and a part of creation. And I realize that many religious people do not share that view of God's relationship to the world. And if you don't, that's quite all right. But if you don't, you may just have to forgive God for creating the world with so much suffering and so much injustice.